Hi guys. Tonight we travel back to a time when warmth was a luxury. When the world outside was blanketed in snow and darkness seemed to stretch forever. You imagine yourself in a vast stone hall, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and damp wool. The candles flicker weakly against the draft, their tiny flames bending under the invisible breath of winter. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the low groan of timber beams shifting in the cold, and you realize there's no central heating, no glass windows to hold the warmth, no electric light to comfort your eyes. The night belongs to the frost. You probably wouldn't survive this without a dozen layers and a very forgiving immune system. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are now? Dim the lights, let your shoulders sink, and imagine stepping into the chill of a medieval night. You trudge through the echoing corridors of a castle, each step stirring dust and cold air. The floor is bare stone, icy beneath your worn leather shoes. The walls, built to last centuries, are thick enough to muffle most sound, yet not enough to keep the cold from creeping in. Torches line the hall, sputtering with that particular hiss of oil catching fire. But the warmth they give barely reaches your fingertips. People of this age understood the cold not as a passing discomfort, but as a constant companion. You pass a servant carrying a bucket of glowing embers, carefully shielding it from drafts. That small pot might be all that stands between a noble family and a night of sleepless shivering. In these vast stone fortresses, fires burned day and night, not for decoration, but survival. Chimneys were still new inventions in much of Europe. Many halls had only open hearths, with smoke curling upward and escaping through a hole in the roof. The smell of wood smoke clung to everything, clothing, hair, and the very air you breathed. You might think castles were cozy havens, but even kings slept in rooms that could freeze water overnight. The thick walls held out invaders, not the cold. Without insulation, every gust of winter air seeped through cracks and arrow slits. Historians still argue whether the grandeur of castles ever compensated for their discomfort. You imagine servants scurrying to hang heavy tapestries, not for decoration, but as makeshift insulation. In one corner, a massive four-poster bed looms, draped in layers of velvet and fur. A nobleman will soon retreat into that small island of warmth, the curtains pulled tight to trap his body heat, but even he will sleep with a woolen cap, for the air that escapes the covers will bite like frost. The rich and poor alike understood that night was a battle. The difference was that the rich fought it with silken servants, while the poor fought it with straw and faith. Outside the castle, the wind howls through the village. You can picture thatched cottages crouched low under snow, their roofs heavy and their doors barred with planks to keep the storm at bay. Inside, the smell of smoke and humanity blends into something earthy and thick. A peasant family huddles together on a shared bed stuffed with straw, the faint glow of a dying fire painting their faces in orange and shadow. It's a hard life, but they know its rhythm. The endless winter, the short days, the long nights that seem to stretch forever. The medieval world knew darkness more intimately than we ever could. Once the sun set, the day was truly over. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, so most people lived by firelight or moonlight. The night was both feared and respected, a realm of rest, prayer, and superstition. You can almost feel the way silence deepened after dusk, interrupted only by the crackle of fire or the occasional howl of a wolf. A quirky detail historians love to mention is how some castles built their staircases clockwise to give defenders an advantage, but that meant cold air spiraled upward through the same stairwells. The chill that swept up the steps was like an invisible river. Servants sometimes slept in the corridors simply to be close to the embers or to guard them through the night. Imagine them curled under cloaks, dreaming in fits, the sound of wind mixing with snores and muttered prayers. Every object around you serves the same purpose: survival. The wooden shutters, the woven rushes on the floor, the fur pelts on chairs. People used everything they had to create a buffer between their bodies and the winter's bite. Sometimes even the animals played a role. Dogs, particularly small lap dogs, were kept close, not for companionship, but for warmth. Some historians suggest noble women would place them in bed first, using them as living hot water bottles before slipping under the covers themselves. The scent of tallow candles fills your nose, thick and greasy, mixed with smoke from the hearth. You can almost taste the bitterness of it. Feel the air clinging to your throat. Yet there's comfort, too. The fire flickers across stone, and the shadows dance on carved walls. You hear a lull in the wind outside. And for a moment, you sense why people found peace here despite the hardship, the darkness, the warmth of a small flame, and the quiet of a world asleep. It's a fragile balance that humans have always sought. You think of how easily we forget this struggle. Our modern nights made bright and warm by machines. In the Middle Ages, winter shaped the soul. People learned patience, thrift, and endurance through those endless cold months. They watched the frost form on windowless walls, and they found beauty even there. It was a time when the stars seemed closer, when every spark in the hearth felt like a miracle. As you drift deeper into the story, you can feel that same ancient calm settling over you. The air is still cold, but now it's a familiar cold, one that reminds you that warmth means more when you have fought for it. The medieval world understood that lesson better than anyone. The night stretches on, the fire sighs, and you begin to sense the rhythm of an age long past a world asleep under a frozen sky. You step outside the castle walls and into the village where the smell of woodsem smoke clings to the air like a second skin. The snow has stopped for now, but the world remains hushed, heavy, and brittle. Beneath the low thatched roofs, peasants curl together in their one-room cottages. You duck through a crooked doorway, and the scent of soot and damp straw greets you instantly. Inside, the only light comes from a small hearth in the center of the room, its flame barely alive, flickering over rough clay walls blackened by years of smoke. You can taste the air, dense and stale, a mixture of old meals, unwashed wool, and ash. You crouch near the fire. A woman sits on a three-legged stool wrapped in a patched shawl, stirring something thick in a pot. Beside her, two children sleep in a corner, buried under a pile of coarse blankets and old clothes. A man lies nearby, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air. This is not comfort, but endurance. They do not expect to be warm. They expect to survive until dawn. Their bed is little more than a raised wooden platform covered in straw and old linen sacks stuffed with whatever material could be spared. Sometimes it was hay or dried bracken, sometimes even moss from the woods. Historians note that the straw was rarely changed, and the smell must have been unforgettable. You lie down on such a bed, the straw crunching beneath you, the scent of earth and animal lingering in the fibers. It pricks at your skin through the thin cloth, and the faint rustle makes every movement sound like whispers. To make it through the night, peasants relied on layers, not of fabric, but of bodies. Families slept together, sometimes 3 generations, sharing one bed or at least one pile of straw. The heat from each person's body was worth more than any luxury blanket. There was no sense of privacy, but there was security in the closeness. You can almost feel the press of shoulders, the mingling of breaths, the heartbeat of the sleeping household. Even the family's few animals, chickens or goats, might huddle nearby, their warmth contributing to the fragile cocoon against the winter. The walls themselves seemed to sigh, made of wile and daub sticks woven together and plastered with clay and dung. They leak both sound and cold. You can hear the moan of the wind outside, but you can also hear every cough, every shift of straw, every murmur of someone dreaming. The thatched roof above is rimed with frost, and sometimes it drips as the heat from the hearth rises. You imagine the slow, irregular plop of melted ice hitting the floor, a rhythm that marks the night's passing. A quirky bit of trivia from chroniclers of the time mentions that some villagers spread herbs like lavender or wormwood among the bedding. They believed the scent could ward off pests and sickness. Perhaps it worked. Perhaps it didn't. Historians still debate how much of medieval medicine was practical and how much was desperate hope. But even a faint scent of herbs would have brought a kind of comfort, a reminder of summer's gentler days. You glance at the hearth again. It is the heart of this tiny home, but the firewood supply is always uncertain. Many peasants gathered fallen branches or dried dung because proper logs were too costly. When the flames died, the room would cool quickly, and breath would frost in the air. Children sometimes woke in the night to rekindle the embers with a few scraps of wood, blowing gently until the glow few red coals, and the air feels like the inside of a cave. Every breath fogs in front of your face, and your hands sting as you stretch them from beneath the covers. The first thought that passes through your sleepy mind is not about breakfast or work, but about warmth. How to keep it, how to make it last. In the medieval world, warmth was an art form. According to most historical records, people relied on layering not only for travel and work, but even for bed. Sleepwear was not the delicate luxury we imagine today. It was a fortress of fabric. You start with a linen shift or shirt, soft from repeated washing, but often patched and worn thin. Over that, you pull on woolen hose that itch faintly, but trap heat better than anything else. A cap for your head, gloves for your hands, even a scarf or kerchief tied snugly beneath your chin. The beds themselves became part of this system. You can feel it as you press your hand against the rough wool blanket, heavy and slightly damp from the night air. Above that, another layer waits, perhaps fur or thick woven cloth. Each sheet, each cover, each garment forms a barrier between your body and the cold world beyond. The poor might rely on coarse wool or patched rags, while the wealthy enjoyed linen sheets, feather mattresses, and imported fur throws. Yet the principle was the same. Trap every bit of heat you can. Archaeological findings from preserved homes and burial sites confirm that layering was central to winter survival. Even corpses were sometimes buried with multiple layers of fabric, suggesting the practice was deeply ingrained. It was not just fashion, it was instinct. You can almost hear the soft rustle of fabric as people bundled themselves in preparation for sleep. The faint sigh of comfort as warmth began to build beneath the weight of the covers. A curious note appears in a few medieval household manuals describing the art of the bed. Servants were instructed to layer the bedclothes in a specific order. The bottom sheet to absorb sweat, the middle for insulation, and the top to block drafts. The result was a kind of textile sandwich, a microclimate of survival. It is oddly scientific, long before science had the language to explain it. There is still no full agreement among scholars about exactly how widespread these methods were. Some argue that elaborate layering was mainly practiced in wealthy households, while others insist that even peasants knew the principle well. The lack of written records from the poor leaves the question open. But you can imagine that experience rather than books taught them what worked. The cold was the best teacher of all. You rise from the bed and wrap a cloak around your shoulders. The texture of wool feels rough but comforting. The faint scent of smoke still clinging to it from last night's fire. The cloak is a constant companion worn indoors and out. In many households, it doubled as an extra blanket draped over sleeping bodies when the air turned biting. It was common for travelers to sleep fully clothed, boots and all, to save themselves from the shock of rewarming frozen garments in the morning. One particularly interesting piece of trivia from French inventories describes how wealthier families stored their winter bedding in cedar chests during the summer months, along with dried herbs like rosemary or lavender to deter moths. When winter returned, the beds were made anew and the faint scent of herbs filled the chambers. You can imagine the moment the blankets were unfolded, the smell of last summer's warmth released into the cold air. As you walk through a small chamber, The sight of a servant shaking out sheets fills the air with dust that glows in the pale morning light. She hums quietly, shaking layer after layer, then lays them neatly on the bed frame. The simple rhythm of the task seems eternal, a small act of defiance against the cold. She knows that these layers, once tucked and smoothed, are more than fabric. They are the thin boundary between comfort and suffering. Most researchers agree that fabric choice often reflected social class. Linen, though breathable, was expensive and prized by the wealthy, while coarse wool was the commoner's shield. Fur, especially from animals like rabbit or fox, was considered a mark of both luxury and vanity. In northern regions, even simpler folk might line their clothing with scraps of fur or felt for extra warmth. Nothing was wasted when the cold pressed in. An eccentric little tradition mentioned in English village records tells of families hanging their bedclothes by the fire each morning to dry the night's moisture and smoke away insects. The process filled the room with the scent of warm fabric and soot, and children often wrapped themselves in the heated sheets for a few stolen moments before bed. It must have been bliss, that fleeting touch of warmth before returning to the chill. You stand beside the window, the frost tracing white veins across the wooden frame. You, too,